Hi and welcome to another Unity tutorial. In this one we're going to continue our C# series and start taking a look at methods. Let's jump right in. Before we get stuck in with our coding, don't forget that all of what we're going to do here is going to be uploaded to my Patreon page, so if you're interested go ahead and check it out and you can access the project files from there. Last week, if you remember, we had a look at variables. Now, variables on their own are great, but they can't really do more than hold their assigned value. So in order to start creating games and applications, we need to start thinking about creating actions that power the behavior of our game objects. So before I start waffling on, let's get stuck into having a look at methods. First thing I'm going to do is go to my scripts folder, I'm going to right click and go to create, C# script, I'm going to call this methods, and hit enter, and then open it up in Visual Studio. So in order to demonstrate this properly, what I'm going to do first is I'm actually going to remove the start and update functions, just to make what I'm doing a little bit clearer. And then now I'm going to declare a variable that we can use to showcase our method. So I'm going to write a simple variable for our player health, and that's going to be of type int. So data type is int. Then we'll use camel case for our variable name. We'll go ahead and type player health, and we'll give it an initial value of say 100. And then finish it off with a semicolon. Now I only want this variable to be accessed by this particular class in this instance, and the class is methods. But I do need to tweak it in the inspector, so what we're going to do here is we're going to put serialized field in front of it. Remember we used this in our previous variable lesson. And now this private variable that we have here will be able to tweak in the inspector. So for some of you who aren't familiar with C# at all, it might surprise you to learn that if you've been following along with these C# tutorials to date, we have actually already been using methods. The start and the update are actually methods. Now you might hear me refer to these as functions sometimes, and I use the terms method and functions quite interchangeably. I change my mind more than I change my underwear on those two. If I say functions, it is methods, but for the sake of consistency, we're going to try and go ahead with methods. So where we've been debugging in our previous tutorials, this was actually using the start method. But what about if we want to create our own methods? Well, we can go ahead. I'm just going to give myself a little bit of space here. And at the moment, we're just going to create a very simple method that's going to take a little bit of health off of our player. And normally when a player loses a health, it's in relation to some sort of damage. So maybe we could create a damage method. So we're going to say void damage player, and then we're going to finish it off with an open and close brackets, and then put in our two curly braces. But what will happen when the damage player method is called, everything in between these two curly braces is going to happen sequentially. At the moment, we have a void damage player, and the void is just saying that we're not going to return anything with this method, and we'll cover return types in just a second. What we'll do, we're going ahead and we'll take some health off the player now. So we can say that our player health equals whatever the player health currently is minus 10, and end it with a semicolon. Then we're not going to be able to see this, so what we're going to do here is we're going to say debug.log, and we want to see the player health. Now while this method exists in our script, in our methods class, it's not actually going to run because we haven't called it yet. Now we know from our previous tutorials that the start function is automatically triggered when we run our Unity game. We can use this start function to call our damage player method. You see there I started to already interchange between functions and methods. Bad Dan. So what we're going to do here is we're going to call our damage player method. Now to do that, all we need to write is the name of the method, and you see it's auto completed here. Go ahead and hit enter, put in our two brackets, and then finish off with a semicolon. And then I'm going to save it there. Now I'm going to hop back into Unity. I'm going to create an empty game object in my hierarchy, and I'm going to put my method script onto that as a component. See here we've got player health. I'm going to bring up my console and then hit play. And you can see here where we initialized player health, we had it at 100. Our start method is now called our damage player method and taken off a certain amount that we specified, which was 10. And now our player health is 90. But you really want your methods to be as flexible as possible. And whilst this will work, we want to be able to specify the amount of damage that we're going to take off of the player. And to do this, we're going to pass in a parameter to our method. So to set up our damage player method in order to take in an integer value, the parameter we're going to pass it is going to be written in the brackets where we declared our method. So in here we're going to type int, which is our data type that we're going to pass it, and then we're going to give it a name. And we're going to call ours amount of damage, like so. And then where we have player health, you can see here instead of our 10, many of you might have noticed that we can now replace it with amount of damage. But you'll notice the squiggly red line has come under where we're calling our method. This is where we want our method to take place. And this is because our actual method requires a parameter to be passed to it of type int. So let's say we want to take off 50 points from one player. So we'll just type in the amount where we're calling the method here. Let's go ahead and save that. And we'll go ahead and play. You can see here it's gone to 50. So this is working great. But what we can do now is we can make this method a lot more generic. At the moment it's quite specialized in it's doing something directly to the player health. But if we think about it, all we're really doing in this method is subtracting one integer from another. So how can we make this damage player more generic and simply return the result of one integer minus another integer? Well, let's take a look at that now. The first thing we want to do is return a value from our method. And a return type is just going to be the result of some calculation that's going on inside our method. The data that we're going to return is going to be an integer. So instead of void, we need to type int as our return type. So we now have int damage player. You see I've got a red squiggly line here. That's because we haven't specified our return yet down in our method. Don't worry, we'll get to that. And then we're going to actually pass in two parameters to our method. We're going to have int num1, num2. And remember, this is just keeping it generic. We need an int here as well. And instead of directly affecting our player health in this method, we're going to create a temporary variable, and we're going to call this result. And the result is going to be num1 minus num2. Now you see we have this calculation where we have a result, and using inferred declaration, this var becomes a type int, and we're minusing the values num1 and num2, which are the parameters that we're passing into our method. So once we've made that calculation, we need to then return the value where we called our method. So we're going to say return, and we want to return the result, like so. Then we have to consider how we're actually going to call this function, because now we need to pass in more than one parameter. We need to pass in another int. First one is going to be our starting number, which is going to be our player health. We can go ahead here and type in player health, and then a comma, and then the number that we're going to subtract is going to effectively our damage, if you like. Now, whilst this would work, we're not actually making use of the return value. We're effectively performing a calculation on our player health. So we could say at the top here, player health is equal to, then when our start method fires, player health is going to be equal to the result of damage player. And it's going to pass in the player health and the damage we want to take off. So it's going to initially pass in 100, and then it's going to pass in 50. We're going to jump to our method where we're going to pass in those parameters. Player health becomes num1, and the damage, which is 50, becomes num2. So then we make a temporary variable here to store a result of num1 minus num2, which is player health minus the damage, and that gets stored in result. And then we are actually passing back the result back up to where we called the method, and it gets stored in player health. We won't be able to see this, and then to make this a little bit easier to see, we'll go ahead and we'll drop our debug in here and write it to our console with debug.log player health. Let's go ahead and save that. So I'll go ahead and change this to something like 500. Go ahead and hit play. Should see 450. There we go. Pop in our console window. So our method was called, and the calculation was performed and returned back. So what we've done is we've created quite a generic method there. When we were being very specific when we first started this tutorial, we were actually affecting player health inside this method. What we've done now is we created a whole separate method which we can effectively use to calculate the result of minusing one number from another. This isn't just limited to the player health anymore. And I can show you an example of how useful this method is. And we can create a serialized field, type int, is going to be the enemy health, and that's going to be equal to 500. And now we can use this same method to perform a calculation. We don't have to go ahead and write a whole other piece of code. We could say enemy health can be equal to damage player, and we, instead of passing it player health, we can pass it the enemy health and also pass it 100. Now here's where it's important to think about the name of your methods. You want to have them be very descriptive. At the moment we've got damage player, which this would be fine if this was just a player class, but because it's confusing when we're trying to do things like enemy health and the method is called damage player, we could probably think about a better name for this. Maybe we could call this something like subtract damage, and we can go ahead and rename all of our previous damage players to subtract damage. See, it's automatically changed it up there. We can go ahead and debug that lot as well. Do another one underneath enemy health. Let's go and have a look at that running. So I've got player health here and then enemy health just below. Here my console. And then we've got the result of our player health and then the result of our enemy health. So you can see the power of methods and how the methods really drive the actions and the power behind our game objects and systems. So every time our method is called, our method is going to run sequentially as a set of instructions. And that's going to happen every time we call our method. And then lastly, one important thing to note is that currently the method that we've written here is actually private, and we can go ahead and make these private, which they're only going to be accessible by this class, or we can actually make them public, which will then make them visible to other classes as well. Well, that's it for this one, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video and found it useful, and if you did, it'll really help me out if you leave a like on the video and support the channel. Next week we're going to be taking a look at logic statements. I'll see you then.